When the war in Ukraine started, one of the first things I mentioned that would be affected was the global energy and food supply chain. And another thing I mentioned was that whether it was Lula or Bolsonaro, that wouldn't make much of a difference. Because Brazil's distancing wasn't just due to ideology, in this case Bolsonaro's political spectrum, being hostile to the G7 bloc of countries, but because it was something on a much deeper level, on a geopolitical level. And I think that's where the European and American leaders got it wrong with Lula. They thought that Bolsonaro's closeness to Putin was just out of spite. And as always happens in politics, those who see things through the lens of idealism instead of realism end up blind and make mistakes. And now it's clear that they're disappointed with Lula, even after having supported him. This is mainly because of the food issue, though several factors are involved. Or, better said, the commodities, which, contrary to what technology enthusiasts have tried to sell over the last 20 years, it's something that still carries a huge weight on the international stage and won't be invalidated anytime soon. In fact, the war in Ukraine has boosted this even more. And now, this is worsened by Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Corridor Agreement. The Black Sea is located south of Ukraine. Now, notice that Ukrainian production, which until 2022 was one of the largest food producers in the world, used to go through here. It was shipped to the global market through here, through the ports of Odessa, Mykolaiv, Yuzhny, and Chornomorsk. Note that the military map indicates Russian forces occupied all of southern Ukraine. So only the southwest part of the country with Odessa remains. Where do merchant ships need to go? They need a Russian guarantee that they won't be attacked in order to enter and leave the port. And from here in the Black Sea they go through the Turkish Straits, and from here either they go west towards the Mediterranean Sea and the Strait of Gibraltar, or they go south through the Suez Canal, from where they will be shipped to the whole world. But without the Russian guarantee, the Ukrainians can't do anything. From July 2022 to June 2023, they exported 32 million tons of products, such as wheat. The problem is that there are still about 18 million tons stored in silos in the region. And they won't leave unless the Russians allow it, and everything indicates that they won't allow it. In fact, the Russians have been bombing those silos. And the reason why the Russians don't want to allow navigation in the region is because they don't want to risk Ukrainian vessels bringing soldiers here to Crimea, where they could carry out sabotage and other types of attacks. Last year, the Ukrainians violated the agreements not to use the Odessa region for attacks at least 5 or 6 times, so now the Russians don't want to take any chances. For you to understand the dilemma of the situation, it would take approximately 700 ships, each carrying 26,000 tons, to transport this Ukrainian production. Since the Ukrainian harvest begins at the end of August, this production needs to be exported, otherwise it will pile up. And to make matters worse, the Ukrainians have nowhere to store this harvest, because most of the silos are still full from last year's harvest. Or, better said, the silos that are left, the ones that weren't destroyed by the Russians, they won't be able to export because of the war. And one important thing is that this was probably the last significant Ukrainian production for the global market. So, in the coming years, we won't see any significant contribution to the world's food market coming from Ukraine. There are several reasons for this. First, because of the lack of labor caused by the war. Second, because most of the productive land is exactly where the fighting is taking place. And it's precisely in these lands that the highest concentration of landmines on the planet is found. And it will take decades to remove all those mines. So, this productive area will remain unproductive for many years. Third, that the Ukrainians simply don't have the ability to obtain material there. And fourth, because of the lack of logistical capacity that I mentioned. And even by land, they don't have enough railways and so on. So we saw the 4th largest wheat exporter in the world, the 4th in corn and the 7th in soybeans lose those positions from one year to the next and become a food importer. In other words, the country, which was one of the largest exporters of the most consumed grains in the world, is now out of the global production chain for an indefinite period. People have no idea how big of a blow this is, because with the explosion in food prices, we will see more and more turmoil and civil conflicts, especially in the Middle East and Africa. By the way, in the Middle East, the last time there was a spike in food prices, the result was the Arab Spring in 2011. Well, but what does this have to do with Brazil? It has to do with two things. The first is the food pressure that will be put on Brazil, which will be enormous, which can, depending on the context, be a good thing. At least so far it has been positive. And the second is that this will heavily reinforce a triangular relationship between Brazil, China, and Russia, which will push Brazil even further away from the North Atlantic axis, leaving them even more frustrated. When Bolsonaro went to negotiate with Putin right in the middle of the war, a lot of people criticized him, but the truth is that it was the right move. While the world started to panic over the lack of fertilizers, Brazil managed to get such a large amount that there was even enough left over to resell to other countries. By the way, it's important to make this clear because some channels, which aren't even about geopolitics, economics, or agribusiness, ended up spreading false information. That Russian fertilizer ships wouldn't even be able to leave Russia because of insurance issues or lack of parts. But obviously they were wrong because all those ships arrived, the fertilizers arrived, and besides that, even with all the sanctions the United States made, look at the irony, an exception for fertilizers and bought a huge amount of fertilizers from Russia, right in the middle of the war. So, this makes it clear how national interests and geopolitics always end up taking precedence over idealism. In this sense, Lula's government has actually been making the right moves regarding its stance toward Russia. The reason, as I mentioned in another video on this channel, would be the same whether it was Lula or Bolsonaro. The truth is that geopolitics has pushed Brazil away from the G7 and brought it closer to other players. More specifically, Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia, although not necessarily the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, because our relationship with the South Africans and Indians is still minimal. Because if we look at these charts, we can see that Brazil's exports have skyrocketed, and not only in terms of dollar volume, but also in the share that exports have in Brazil's gross domestic product, and that's because this chart only goes up to 2021, which is before the Ukraine war, when exports accounted for 20% of Brazil's gross domestic product. What was exported and to whom? It's clear there's a strong relationship with China, which alone accounts for 3 times more than the second, which is the United States. And if we look at the details for the Chinese market, it's even clearer that the vast majority are food products. Whereas, if we look at the details for the second, the United States, we'll see that they are mostly mineral and energy commodities. And as I said, these are data from 2021, that is, before the war, because if we look at 2022, we'll see that this remained the same. And in the Chinese market, it's clear how Brazil has increased its share year after year. While the Chinese share in Brazil's gross domestic product has been increasing up until 2020, the year of the pandemic, it is still retracting. In the future, we might discuss the suspicious Chinese economic movement, but today, Brazil is the focus of the video, because Brazil has increased its participation in the Chinese market. This is due to agribusiness, the distancing of the United States from China, and Brazil's closer relationship with Russia. And if we look at Russian exports to Brazil, we'll see that Brazil didn't play a major role in Russia's foreign trade. 2022, the year of the war. That probably increased, probably because Russia still hasn't released the economic data for 2022 for obvious reasons. They don't want to reveal how much sanctions have affected the country. But has Chinese money been fueling Brazilian agribusiness in recent years? Starting in 2022, with Ukraine's reduced presence in the global market and Russian restrictions in Western markets, it's clear how the war benefited Brazil, in the sense that Brazil now takes on part of the role those two countries had in supplying food to the world. With the year 2022, and especially from 2023 onwards, Brazil has been expanding its number of clients. If we look at Brazil's export data for the months of March, April, May and June 2023 and compare them with previous years, it's clear how Brazil has been exporting more than ever. And as I said, this is due to this triangular relationship between Brazil, China and Russia. Because if we look at the role of imports from Russia to Brazil, we see that it has skyrocketed. In other words, Brazil has been buying more from Russia than ever before, and we can see that the absolute majority of imports, more than 70% of the trade, are precisely fertilizers. In short, the abundance of Russian fertilizers is supplying Brazilian agriculture, which is profiting more than ever from its exports. To China, Europeans and other Asians, although mostly to China. And where are these fertilizers going? If we look at the import data, we see first that no country even came close to Russia in supplying fertilizers and manure to Brazil, and second, that the states that had Russia as their main in 2022 suppliers included Bahia, Goiás, Maranhão, Mato Grosso do Sul, Pará, Pernambuco, Piauí, Rio Grande do Norte, São Paulo, Sergipe and Tocantins, or Russia, being the second supplier in Alagoas, Espírito Santo, Minas Gerais and Paraná. In other words, Russia supplies the Brazilian agribusiness. And no matter how much some who are anti-Russia want it, the truth is that there is no alternative in the world at the same price as Russian fertilizers. Because one thing that most people don't understand is that if you take this productive food-producing area, making a kind of strip that would cover it, from Rio Grande do Sul's interior to Rondônia in the west and Maranhão in the east, we'll see that a large part of this territory would naturally be hostile to production, agriculture and livestock, which makes this region need to compensate for this hostility with fertilizers, and a lot of fertilizers. In fact, Brazil is the second country that uses the most fertilizers in the world. I've seen people saying that it's wonderful land, that everything you plant grows, but that's not true. In most of the country, we need fertilizers and pesticides on a large scale to make this happen. This, in turn, makes production more expensive compared to other countries, like Argentina and the United States, which have territories that are naturally more suitable for agriculture and livestock. But since Russia has been selling huge amounts of fertilizers at a reasonably low price, we've been able to make up for that since 2022. Notice that the price per ton of fertilizers at the ports in January 2022 was much higher than it is now in July 2023. These charts show China was Brazil's top buyer in 2021 and bought even more in 2023. Again, because Brazil has replaced Ukraine and has benefited from droughts in Argentina and the United States. So this triangular relationship is the point of our video. Today, Brazil, Russia and China are part of the same trade mechanism, and there's little that the United States and Europe and even Brazil, if they wanted to, could do to break this chain. Brazil is highly dependent on the import of fertilizers. Potassium chloride comes 95% from abroad, nitrogen 80% and phosphate about 60%. At least in the short term. And the longer the war lasts, the stronger this Russian, Brazilian and Chinese interconnection will become. And this relationship with Russia, whether directly, as I mentioned, because of fertilizers, or indirectly due to the effects of the war. Because when we talk about exports to China, the vast majority is soybeans, as everyone already knows. But today it's going beyond that. Brazil has drastically, and I mean drastically, increased its share in the global corn market. And this market is more diversified than the soybean market, because basically all the soybeans go to China. But corn expands the relationship with other Asian countries. The United States, Brazil, Argentina and Ukraine are by far the largest corn producers. But the United States, even though they produce more than twice as much corn as Brazil, consume much more than Brazilians do. So, for the first time in history, Brazil, even though it produces less than the United States, will export more than the United States. So Brazil will be the world leader in corn exports. Argentina, on the other hand, besides being far behind in corn production, has been struggling with drought. Credit for producers, access to parts and machinery, and so on. This has hindered both production and the flow of that production to the global market. And Ukraine, as I said, is at war and will probably stop exporting corn starting next year. This will further expand Brazil's position, which, starting next year, will dominate the global soybean and corn markets, which are two of the four main grains. And not only in corn and soybeans, but also in beef, chicken and pork proteins, as well as cotton, where the dominant buyer is also China. Just out of curiosity, the four main grains most consumed in the world that I mentioned are soybeans, wheat, corn and rice. In other words, Brazil will dominate two of the four main grains most consumed in the world. A lot of people impress me because they're angry at China because of this, as if China is buying Brazil as part of some kind of communist domination plan, but that's not the case. Not only is it ridiculous to call China communist, but China is not buying Brazil, it's buying from Brazil. And on top of that, never in the history of Brazil has any nation put as much money into Brazilian territory as the Chinese have. And unlike other countries, they basically don't care at all or interfere in Brazil's internal affairs. The Chinese logic is basically, as long as you sell, I will buy. Besides, as I said before, the United States, if you look at their security and geopolitical literature, you'll see that they've never been very concerned about South America as a whole since World War II ended. So they simply don't know what to do or how to deal with the rise of Chinese trade here. And by all indications, maybe they're not even that worried, despite that. Anyway, as I mentioned last year, whether it was Bolsonaro or Lula, geopolitics would outweigh ideology. And Brazil's geopolitics has been moving away from the North Atlantic axis because it was drawn in by Chinese geopolitics. At the same time, that it was pushed away by the geopolitics of the United States and the European countries. Therefore, any change that the G7 might want from Brazil should be aimed at the long term. Because in the short and medium term, Brazil is already deeply intertwined with Russia and China, not having many options for now to avoid this, even if it wanted to. I doubt Brazil really wants to change this triangular relationship. So the pressure from the North Atlantic bloc, since it won't be able to attract Brazil, will probably need to pressure Brazil, above all through environmental and green agendas which mainly target Brazil's Achilles heel, which is agribusiness. Because if it targets agribusiness, it will hit deeply Brazil, and based on that, pull Brazil back. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know. Your help is absolutely essential for me to keep bringing you real geopolitics content. And don't forget to check out my other channel, Futuristic Horizons, where I talk about science, technology, futurism, and science fiction. Thank you all, hugs, and see you in the next video.